morning, everyone. I'm I'm the co-director of PONARS Eurasia, together with my colleague Professor Hale, and an associate director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at the Elliott School. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the annual conference of PONARS Eurasia. It's where the long-named program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia. It is, for those of you who are new to our program, a network of over 100 scholars, mainly from the United States, Russia, and other post-Soviet states, who specialize in issues of security and politics in Russia and Eurasia, who are committed to connecting their scholarship to policy here in the United States and or in their home country, and who wish to be part of an international community of scholars who are committed to developing policy-relevant and collaborative research. We also are constantly on the lookout for the best rising and mid-range scholars from the United States, Canada, and post-Soviet states, and European states as well. So if you have good colleagues that you'd like to pass their names on to us, we'd be happy to know them. Of course, we can't possibly have all of the best scholars on the region, but I'm sure that we have many of the best, and you'll have an opportunity to hear them and to interact with them today. The members that we have here that are serving as panelists and chairs over the course of the next 2 days are mainly from the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. We also have members here from Armenia, Estonia, Finland, Norway, and the UK. Hopefully I'm not missing anyone else. All of our PONARS members who will be presenting or are chairs or are here in the audience have name tags with the PONARS Eurasia logo on them, so please do feel free to approach them to ask them more about their presentations or their work. We invite conference participants to write on topics of their choosing. We, of course, usually end up with some dominant themes. Like last year, Ukraine is a major focus of our event. This year, we have 3 panels, today and tomorrow, 2 of them today, on Ukraine. And those panels cover the effects of the Ukraine conflict on identity, governance, and politics, and especially a rich selection of presentations on the Ukraine conflict and its aftermath. We'll also have a panel on Putinism, what it is there such a thing, the nature of the political and economic system in Russia today. We'll have a panel later today on the state of Russian military power in the wake of the Ukraine conflict, a panel tomorrow on ideology and the Russian state, a panel on international security issues, a panel tomorrow on economic and social issues, one on Central Asia, and one on the common neighbors of the EU and Russia, Belarus, Georgia, and Armenia. So as you can see, our members cover the gamut. They'll be presenting in a slightly different fashion than we've done in past conferences for those of you that are regular attendees. Rather than produce the policy memos that the presentations are based on in advance, they'll be presenting their presentations on the basis of draft memos that then we'll be publishing online. So if you're not on our mailing list, then please be sure to have us add you so you'll be notified when those policy memos are in. And also, this arrangement gives our authors an opportunity to incorporate your feedback. So please don't hesitate to ask questions, piercing questions. Comments are also welcome, if short, please. And then particularly for our embassy guests, we simply ask for no statements, only short comments and questions. But we thank everybody who is in attendance. We also particularly thank all of our participants that have come from all over the world to be with us today. We'll have 3 sets of breakout sessions, 1 opening session. This starts to be the complicated part, and then for the rest of the day we'll have 2 simultaneous sessions. 1 session in here, 1 session in the Linder Commons, which is on the 6th floor right down the stairway there. Coffee available on both floors. Do remember that the conference continues tomorrow. We welcome all of you to attend if you'd like to take part of your Saturday morning to join us. We will ask all of our chairs to be fairly strict in their timekeeping to ensure plenty of time for discussion. And finally, of course, this hopefully will be a very smooth 2 days for all of you, but there's a lot of effort that goes into putting together a conference like this. Many thanks first to our events team here at the Elliott School, to Elliot Jorns, our program assistant for PONARS, Sasha Schmemann, our managing editor, our Irish director, Peter Rolberg, and our operations manager, Evan Alterman, other Irish staff and student volunteers who are here today, Matt McDonald, George Carey, Kayla Vega, Caleb Crawford, Rose Blanchard, Valeria Bondareva, and Laura Hope Gamble, and last but not least, a very special thanks to Carnegie Corporation of New York, its Vice President Diana Arsenian for all of their support for the mission of PONARS Eurasia and the work that we do. So thank you very much, and I turn it over to our colleague Henry, who will open up the first panel.
Okay, thank you very much. Can people hear me? Okay, so this panel, we figured we'd start with one of the major issues of great interest to most anyone who is following politics in the region, and that is the crisis involving Ukraine. And so this particular panel will focus on issues related to the war and to Ukrainian identity there. And then later we'll have panels more focused on internal developments of reform and reconstruction in the next panel, and then following that tomorrow there'll be an additional panel that focuses on some of the other related issues to the Ukraine events. So I will not speak myself for long. We want to get straight to the presenters, but just asking them each to stick to about 10 minutes. So that way we'll have plenty of time for interaction, which is an essential part of the conference. So we want to have dialogue between the audience here, because I know many of you are following these events very closely yourselves with your own expertise. So we want, above all, to promote dialogue. So I'll just go in the order that people are listed in the program. So the first speaker will be Mikhail Alexseev of San Diego State University. And he'll be talking on war and socio-political identities in Ukraine. Thank you.
Now the time that I'm setting up the PowerPoint doesn't count as part of 10 minutes. So the war, since Russia's militarized invasion of Ukraine in February 2014, an armed conflict over East Ukraine's Donbas region has resulted in over 7,000 deaths, 17,000 wounded, over 1 million internally displaced persons, and about 600,000 refugees. The question arises, what kind of effects war fighting may have on social and political identities in Ukraine? Will we see Ukraine move toward social inclusiveness and law-based political pluralism, or toward ethnocentrism, social radicalism, and authoritarianism? Would a continuing armed conflict strengthen public enthusiasm for difficult reforms to bring Ukraine into the European Union and NATO, or would it breed disillusionment with the West and revive support for integration with Russia? A lot of questions can be asked. When you look at scholarship on this issue, you realize that there are a lot of knowledge gaps. It seems to me on the whole that we have studied a lot how identities shape wars and a lot less on how wars shape identities. And research points different directions. On the one hand, there are studies showing that exposure to armed conflict within state significantly increases social and political intolerance. And not only to what the group people are fighting, but in general. On the other hand, there are studies that show that people, when they go through armed conflict exposure, become more resilient, participate in democratic institutions more. And also, you will find that a lot of research on this issue deals with civil wars, while Ukraine-Russia conflict is predominantly an interstate war. So, how are things shaping up in Ukraine? What is the response of Ukrainian society so far? Ideally, you would conduct targeted opinion surveys before and after. We don't have this thing yet. What I did was I looked at the most reputable public opinion survey data available in open sources to see what kind of before and after data points we can get on key measures traditionally used to assess social, political tolerance and identities. So here are some findings. By the way, I'm not going to present too much details about these surveys. I would say that most of them are nationwide surveys On average, between 1,500 and 2,500 respondents, with the pretty low margin of sampling error. The survey, the sociology in Ukraine has developed quite a bit, and a lot of this data is quite solid. So this is what we find. First, regarding the national identity and the pride in the nation. Generally what we find that across Ukraine, civic national pride and the sense of national belonging spiked since the start of the armed conflict. This has been the most notable change in public opinion. For example, the sense that Ukraine is an independent state. There were low points. In 1993, for example, only 56% of respondents said that supported Ukrainian independent statehood. In 2013, 83% did, but by mid-2014, 90%. So that was a huge rise. In terms of identity, identities, of course, we have multiple identities. They can be national, regional, ethnic, etc. So if you look at this kind of data, you will also see that since 2013, the idea that individual first identity is with Ukraine as a nation has increased considerably, whereas regional identities decline, predominantly at the expense of the regional identity and the identity as former Soviet citizen. Also, Iran tested for the reverse. Do people support autonomy for their regions? And we see a huge decline in that regard. The number of people who said, no, I don't want autonomy for my province, was 56% in 2013, you don't see it here, but 62% in 2014 and 79% in 2015. So as the war went on, fewer people wanted autonomy for their province. And by the way, in 2015, I looked by region, and by region, overwhelmingly, people don't want autonomy. Even in Donbass, in the areas of Donbass not occupied by the Russian regular and irregular military forces and their local mercenaries, we see 63% of respondents who don't want their province to be independent. In the east in general, 64%. In the south, 72% don't want their provinces to be autonomous. And in the west, 94%. So we have that rising sense of national unity. We also see not many changes, and I would say I was actually very heartened to see not many significant changes with respect to measures of things like xenophobia, exclusionism, ethnic distance, and stuff like that. Partly because on those measures in particular, we see exposure to war having negative effects on social tolerance, which means the Ukrainian society is kind of holding up under pressure. On language, what we see is there is a slight increase in people who speak mostly Ukrainian, a decline of people who say they speak mostly Russian, but that's a heartening trend. The rise of those who say they speak both Russian and Ukrainian, which is a sign of piano rise in inclusiveness in Ukrainian society. Xenophobia, generally at bay. Overall, if you look at this xenophobia index by country, and 7 is the highest on that index, most xenophobic, 0 is the least xenophobic. You only see the rise of xenophobia toward Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the ethnic Russians, but not too much. For all other ethnic groups, you see a slight decline of xenophobia. But overall, generally, we don't see huge change, which is in some ways remarkable, given the war effects. We see, however, quite some hardening. Some opinion agencies were able to poll people in the occupied, separatist-occupied forces regions of Donbass, and we see quite a bit of rise in xenophobia there toward various ethnic groups. As far as the church religious identities are concerned, predictably we see some change regarding the allegiance toward Kiev Patriarchate versus Moscow Patriarchate in terms of the largest number of Ukrainian believers of Orthodox. But on the whole, there is still a lot of tolerance. People in the East and in the West don't see the predominant churches there, the Orthodox and the Greek Union, as necessarily, you know, the church of the enemy or some kind of artificial union imposed on Ukraine. There is still a lot of mutually tolerant perception on these scores. In the memo that will be published, you will see all these results. In terms of political attitudes, support for democracy has remained high. 53% of respondents in Ukraine say that democracy is the best form of government. 40% said they wouldn't trade democracy for more benefits or welfare. And support for the radical parties has remained pretty low. So the Svoboda, private sector, the communists, in opinion polls asking who would you vote for if elections were held today, and these polls are pretty much very, very marginal. All these differences are well within the margins of sampling error. In terms of geopolitical orientations, clearly there is a shift toward Europe. And more broadly, a significant increase in the number of people who want Ukraine to orient its foreign policy toward Europe and the West as opposed to Russia. A significant rise in the number of people wanting to join the European Union. One estimate in May 2015 was that if a referendum were held, and among the likely voters in Ukraine, about 63% would vote for joining the EU. At the same time, however, there are some signs that this is not necessarily something to be taken for granted, and the later May 2015 poll showed that some decline compared to December 2014 in support for joining EU, particularly in the West. The drop from 88% to 78%, in the central Ukraine from 62 to 57%, in the East remaining the same, 22% support. So this suggests, and I think that's important, the orientation toward the European Union, because in many ways this is what people believe Ukraine is fighting the war for these kinds of values and ideas. I wanted to end with a picture and to sum up the results, and I chose this one. It was a friend of mine from back in Kiev University days who emailed it to me after the revolution in February 2014 was over. And I, you know, this is a very, to me, Ukrainian thing. I didn't experience it when I lived there in the Soviet days, but, you know, I associated more with flowers than with anything else, Ukraine as a country, after the Soviet collapse. And it was amazing to see just these flowers pouring into the streets at the end of the revolution. But look at the poster in the background. That what attracted my attention in this photo. It said, you know, get rid of the cavalcades, that's Yanukovych corrupt government, and East and West together. So that's the spirit, I think, that we see growing. It is fragile. War can still challenge Ukrainian society on many levels. And so perhaps in terms of policy recommendations, one thing to think about is whether institutions of the West and the United States are trapped into a reverse causality problem. Rather than wait for Ukraine to meet certain formal criteria, use the opportunity that the society is resilient and conduct more inclusive policy to engage Ukraine as much as possible with institutions to show the people that they're not fighting and dying in vain. Thank you very much.
Next we have Volodymyr Dubovyk from Odessa Mechnikov National University, and he'll be talking about Odessa, a local dimension of Ukraine's revolution, crisis, and conflict.
You need to push the button here, or is it on? Okay. Thank you, Henry. And indeed, so you can hear. So, okay. Indeed, the subject of my presentation is dealing with the situation in the city of Odessa and the region of Odessa. I think we have a bunch of presentations here dealing with domestic policies in Ukraine and various aspects of those policies, but mine perhaps is the most local slash regional, sub-regional and so on. Obviously, why are we choosing this subject at all? Why have a whole memo dealing with Odessa situation? For various reasons. First of all, Odessa definitely made a lot of news, in addition to what happened to Crimea and what's happening in Donbass. Odessa made news at least twice worldwide, into 2014 because of events, tragic events on May 2nd. Then in 2015, a more positive side, the appointment of Mr. Saakashvili as the governor of Odessa, Odessa region. Why are we even talking about Odessa? Is Odessa important? I mean, I would argue it is, not just because I am from Odessa, but also it's one of the biggest cities in Odessa, the largest one in south of Ukraine. It has a lot of importance for the, as a transit trade hub, always been one for 200 plus years. Now, by now, being a major transit trade hub for the region. It borders on 2 different countries. It is a major academic center with a lot of universities and so on. It has some industrial potential, which is actually, its significance is increasing, I think, because a lot of what we lost in Donbass for the time being, now with that being said, what we have left in other regions of Ukraine has a higher value now to Ukrainian industry and Ukrainian industrial base. And then Odessa also have a lot of transportation arteries and paths coming through, big rivers, then others, you know. So I guess Odessa matters a lot. Odessa did matter a lot for Moscow, for our opponents, for Mr. Putin, who was also always mentioning, not forgetting, and never forgetting to mention Odessa in his line of places that hold a specific place, significant place in Novorossiya, New Russia concept of his. Didn't play well so far, this concept, this practical implementation, but I don't think anyone's given up quite yet entirely on this concept and in attempts of actually doing something about bringing it into life. Now, because of the time constraints, I'm going to kind of float very briefly in the telegraphic mode over this year and a half, and almost 2 years now, in the life of Odessa, and then switch to what's going on right now, and specifically address this issue of how successful this Saakashvili governance in the region is, because it seems to be, to many audiences, you know, on this side of the pond, that's what most people would like to know. You know, what do you think? It's like, how is this actually successful or not, and what's going to happen? Now, Odessa, of course, was split by events of Euromaidan. Obviously, a lot of people who were used to vote for Mr. Yanukovych and party of regions, they were not happy with him even prior to the events of Euromaidan. But then Euromaidan happened, and the city was split. Obviously, there was a more spirited and self-organized and self-funded pro-Maidan camp, and then was more of a centrally controlled and centrally funded anti-Maidan camp. They clashed on a number of occasions. Until May 2nd of 2014, it was more of a kind of small, minor clashes and so on. But then, of course, on May 2nd, the major clash happened, and which was a major bloodshed in Ukrainian history in recent 2 years outside of Donbass, and also the only one major case of a lot of people being victims and casualties where no military and no police forces were involved. Actually, citizens violence in that particular case. Now, for a while, Odessa region was kind of ungoverned, because what you had a new central government in Kiev, but which was very weak in terms of its representation in various regions, and that was definitely the case in Odessa, because after all, Yanukovych has managed to construct a very strong vertical of power, everything, judges, prosecutor office, police people, people in city council, Oblast regional council, everyone was basically Yanukovych people, so there was very strong vertical, and for a couple of months at least, since the event of Yanukovych fleeing the country, Odessa was de facto in the hands, you know, of those ex-former Yanukovych people, with this new pro-Maidan kind of government being in Kiev. So that was kind of disparity there, and that was a moment of instability, and there was a space for the trouble, and that trouble was invited, and the trouble happened on May 2nd. I'm not going to spend much time on May 2nd. I've talked about it last year here at the PONARS conference and many other occasions as well. The question is still looming large. What was it? Was it an attempt to continue with the Slavyansk Donetsk scenario, Was it more of a local initiative of pro-Russian activists, separatists, so-called separatists? Some people question, do we all call them all separatists? Because some of them are not necessarily in favor of succeeding away from Ukraine, becoming part of Russia. Some just having grievances with central government and so on. Others are calling for more autonomy for the region and so on. But many of them were in that camp actually separatists, favoring this idea of Ukraine, Odessa as a city in the region, leaving Ukraine and becoming part of the Russian Federation. So there was a direct clash, and maybe someone was testing the waters or something like that, or maybe someone in Moscow was misled by reports from the ground, basically saying, you just started, you have the spark, and then there will be just this rebellion, and everyone would be in the streets, and the entire population of the city and the region would be coming out with Russian flags and so on, and then you would have this natural, kind of mild spread of Novorossiya concept into real life. But that didn't happen, as we know. Tragically enough, it cost a lot of lives for Odessans, but that never really happened. Then there was a tense period of time in the life of Odessa, definitely a very tense summer of 2014. The city was basically deserted, but everyone who was in the city, Odessans, we were there, but everyone else was just out. People were too scared to visit. And then, yet we had successful elections, both presidential in May last year and also parliamentary in October last year. And those really created a different political landscape for the city and for the region. The party of regions and what less were unraveled, as we know, and Mr. Poroshenko, who is actually originally from Odessa region, by place of birth, Mr. Poroshenko got a lot of votes in Odessa. Never ever before people like Yushchenko and Tymoshenko got that much vote in the city of Odessa or region of Odessa. So that was successful. And then what came in place instead of party of regions or opposition bloc, they were not as successful. Definitely not in May last year, and not that much in October last year as well, because the results, the figures that they got in the end were much lower comparing to what party of regions Yanukovych was getting in previous years. So, but then the potential for the trouble was still there. I mean, a lot of people asking, can we foresee another May 2nd? That's probable. The probability is much lower than it was a year and a half ago, but that's still there. There are some destabilization attempts specifically aimed at South Bessarabia, western part of Odessa Oblast, where you have this ethnic diversity, a lot of Gagauz, Bulgars, and Moldovans, Romanians, and so on. A lot of people, presumably outside of Ukraine, maybe some in Ukraine, would like to see some trouble steering from that particular region, specifically with Transnistria being next door. Transnistria always played a big role for Odessa, in Odessa political life and economic life, with smuggling and everything. It's on a down. I mean, that's a decrease, the amount of smuggling and everything, but I suppose some of it's still going on. And now let me switch to Saakashvili. When he came to power to be governor of Odessa, a lot of people had this extreme positions on this. Some were euphoric. Now we're good, now we're going to have this full package of reforms implemented in Odessa. On other extreme, people were outraged and saying, like, what's going on? Why is it Georgian president is coming to be governor of a particular region within Ukraine and so on. I was, from the very beginning, from the outset, personally, I was kind of like, well, why so many emotions? Let's wait and see what happens, what he can deliver and what he can deliver. And he's been very good in terms of his public relations, as always, in terms of being accustomed to being in the limelight, in terms of making big statements, and transparency of his government and coming out with the citizens. That was something which was different, really, to what we saw before, just as a region, because previous governors were basically sitting in their offices all the time, day and night, and then Mr. Saakashvili is always on the street. So that's style difference and change. That's definitely obvious. It's visible. Another thing that initially and still he has a lot of limitations on what he can do. After all, he was just a governor of Odessa. Appointed by President, as Romania as players involved, not just oligarchs, but also other branches of power. And now he's there to see it. Now he's complaining a lot about other branches of power preventing him from doing these good things. I personally, many people like myself, we definitely didn't like his recent vicious attacks on the cabinet of ministers. I think he's becoming too much involved and engaged in this domestic politicizing, political infighting within Ukraine, basically taking sides and showing his ambitions and proving to us that our suspicions that he is there in Odessa for a while, not for too long, and basically using this as some kind of starting position, starting pad and trampoline to go higher, perhaps to this position of Prime Minister of Ukraine. are true, that the suspicions are true. In the meantime, he did achieve a little bit. He came up with this team of reformers. I jokingly often call it a Noah's Ark of reformers in Odessa, regional state administration. A bunch of people, some Maidan activists, some people are actually activists in the Ukrainian American community. Others, like Maria Gaidar, whose appointment I really didn't get. I mean, what is credit for this appointment? Because first of all, I don't see her having experience or knowledge that would be useful, what she can contribute to the reform process in the Odessa region, I just don't know. And secondly, with the situation, war situation with Russia, let's call it what it is, it's kind of strange to appoint someone in this administration whose position was ambiguous and kind of vague in terms of what she thinks about what's going on with Crimea and Donbass. In the meantime, Mr. Saakashvili achieved this open skies agreement for Odessa, but then, of course, we need to reconstruct our airport. Another thing that what he did, he cut drastically the number of officials in the regional state administration. I'm concluding. A lot of people like that because he did it twofold. You know, it's nowhere else in Ukraine you cut, any other government cut people in the state administration twofold. He did that. Even though I know some people who I think were doing good jobs there and now they are without jobs, but anyway. He's trying to tackle this issue of customs, which is extremely corrupt. Not that in other places in Ukraine they're not corrupt, but in Odessa there's a lot of flow of cargo and goods and everything through customs, so that's an important issue. Something which is very popular is that he opened a couple of beaches for public access. I don't think that's really a big achievement for a governor in his 3+ months of being governor of Odessa, but a lot of people tend to think that that's one of those achievements. But yet, unfortunately, still in many cases, he still promises a lot and delivers not enough. He still hasn't been there for too long, but it already seems, unfortunately, that he's kind of bored with what he's doing there, and he's ready to go on. You know, and that's only proves that all of these extreme predictions, like he's going to fail dramatically or he's going to achieve everything he promised, are just not true. And something in the middle is more appearing as a more of a more realistic estimate and assessment of what he's been doing in Odessa. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Volodymyr Kulyk, the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. The title of his presentation and draft policy memo is One Nation, Two Languages, National Identity and Language Policy in Post-Maidan Ukraine.
Thank you. Okay, so as you see from the title already, there is a lot of overlap with Alexei's presentation. Actually, it's more than I expected. But now I can use what he said. Now I can use what he said to cut some stuff I prepared and go on. Two main differences between approaches of Mikhail and mine are first. I do base my conclusions about changes in Ukrainian identity on two surveys before the Maidan and after the Maidan and the initial stage of the war. So I can compare more strictly what changed. And in addition to that, I use a set of focus group discussions. So my surveys are from February 2012 and September 2014. So the Maidan in the initial stage of the war, and a set of focus group discussions in 4 Ukrainian cities, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kirovrad, and Chernivtsi, in different parts of the country, as those of you familiar with geography can judge, in February and March 2015. So I will have quantitative and qualitative analysis. I mean, in 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. And second, and second reservation is that well, Mikhail argued that these changes are due to the war, to the external aggression, or what is widely believed to be external aggression. I also argue that some of those changes started already during the Maidan, so before Russia stepped in visibly. Yeah. So and there is some actually tension between changes induced by the Maidan, by this empowerment, enthusiasm, democratic upheaval, and what happened next, it was not only the war and tension and kind of strain imposed by the war, but also severe economic crisis and some disillusionment and feeling of powerlessness. Okay, so now to my presentation. So this is what partly starts as what Mikhail said: a strong attachment to Ukrainian nation, culture and language, identification as a Ukrainian, greater pride and so on. But reverse side of this coin is stronger alienation from Russia in all its kind of facets. Obviously from the Russian state, partly from the Russian people, and to an extent unknown from the Russian language. And these changes can be attributed to Russian aggression and or the Maidan. I started with analyzing public discourse, also social network discourse, and realized that most of these statements about what changed are based on elite and activist perceptions. And so the aim of this research was to verify these elite perceptions or activist perceptions on the mass level, to see how congruent they are. And I will be analyzing, the data I already mentioned, I will be analyzing changes in two dimensions of identity. First is salience of national identity vis-a-vis other identities, both territorial anchored from local to global, but also other, all kinds of social identities. I will see what exactly I compare it with. And second, content of national identity, what it means to belong to this collectivity, to this Ukrainian nation, what it means to be Ukrainian. So salience is, of course, in line with what Mikhail presented. I compare 2012 and 2014 in this case, and it's clear that the salience of national identity, who do you consider yourself primarily? So just one answer. Is a citizen of Ukraine, or resident of your locality, or resident of your region, resident of the citizen of the Earth, resident of post-Soviet space, and European. Primarily, of course, you will be surprised how few people consider themselves European, but that's not just European, primarily European. So, of course, very few of those who are strongly feeling European consider themselves more European than Ukrainian. So Ukrainian identity increased and local decreased second strongest. So now the gap is wider. Ukrainian identity is also more salient than all others' identity, except identity is defined by gender, primarily female identity. So for women, usually gender identity is more important because some social identities are not as open to them as to male. So all others, local, orthodox, regional, pensioner, patriot, are much less salient. But region-wise, these identities are not evenly distributed across the country. So you will definitely see that in the West and Center, the national identity is much stronger than in what I call East, South, and the Donbass. So the Donbass are Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, and all other parts from Kharkiv through Dnipropetrovsk to Odessa is what I call East/South. We see that there are differences between Center and the West and this East-South, but also increasingly between East-South and the Donbass. So the pattern is instead East versus West, becoming the Donbass versus the rest, and it will be seen in other cases as well. So some explanations from focus group discussions. Empowerment after the Maidan, but also frustration with crisis and poverty, feeling of helplessness, a better attitude towards the country or nation, but not necessarily the state. So this is how people resolve these contradictions. So I still love my country, but I'm ashamed or frustrated or antagonized by what the state is doing. So now to content. I wrote these attitudes towards the attributes of nation, but it's not all attributes. Starting with attributes, I provided data on attitudes toward national anthem and language. The question was, how has your attitude towards the following changed for the last year? So has become better or same or worse. Yeah, and so it's clear that attitudes toward what's perceived as attributes of nation has significantly improved, which means that that's how a strong attachment and love and pride is manifested. And remarkably, the attitude towards the Ukrainian language has changed pretty much the same as towards the anthem and the flag. So the language is perceived not just the property of some Ukrainians, those who speak it primarily, but in some way it shouldn't be kind of taken for granted. It should be verified what exactly makes property of all Ukrainians. So now our national treasure is the national language. Yeah. In contrast, attitudes towards the Russian language is mostly the same, a bit worse, especially among Ukrainian speakers, and the attitude towards the Russian state has predictably strongly worsened, yeah, so deteriorated. The change towards the worse is more than the remaining attitude, so which is very unusual because mostly we keep our attitudes with us as we go. Yeah. So about the Russian people are in Ukraine are rather ambivalent. On the one hand, in response to the statement, whatever the authorities do, the Russian people will always be close to the Ukrainian one. People mostly agreed, fully or rather agreed. But at the same time, in focus group discussions, it was revealed that people are not exactly happy with what Russian people are doing. Yeah, so they're not only not protesting, but also following their leaders like sheep. One participant in Kyiv said, not trying to seek truth, just believe what they are fed by propaganda. Okay, thank you. Perhaps in most visible controversy contradiction to what that statement above is saying, Russians are no longer considered a brotherly people. So they are close, but no longer brotherly. Some other peoples, like Georgians, Lithuanians, and Poles, who are providing more support for Ukrainians in their struggle, are considered more worthy of that title. Another dimension of the content which is important in this response, in this regard, is greater embrace of Ukrainian nationalism, past and present. So here I compare attitudes toward leader of Ukrainian nationalism during the war and after the war, who is believed to be the leader, even though much of the war he spent in German concentration camp and didn't influence much of actions of Ukrainian nationalists, but still he was made into a symbol both by the nationalists themselves and by the Soviets, who demonized him and made him more important than he was at most stages. Stepan Bandera, yeah? So I compared attitudes toward him and toward Stalin, his main antagonist, who crushed the Ukrainian nationalist resistance, and that's why considered paradigmatic enemy of that resistance. Yeah, 2012 and 2014, the changes go in the opposite directions. Towards Stalin, worse; toward Bandera, better. And now, if you compare 2012, Bandera was considered the worst. And now Bandera is better than treated by Ukrainians than Stalin. Of course, there is huge regional division. Towards the Russian language, to explain why people are mostly not changing their attitudes, this is Kharkiv group. We are accustomed to that. We do not associate the language with Russia. It is not the language we are at war with, and so all kind of explanation justifying not feeling what opponents say sometimes that it is an enemy language. No, for most Ukrainians it is not an enemy language, and it is not considered incompatible with Ukrainian patriotism and strong attachment to Ukrainian identity. Yeah. Okay, so finally, having said that about languages, if asked what language do you want the state to promote primarily, most Ukrainian in all regions, but the Donbass say Ukrainian. Not all equally, not final option majority language, meaning in each region, in each part of the country, whatever language is spoken by the majority there. So it's only in the Donbass that this option is preferred, everywhere else it's primarily Ukrainian. So people want the state to treat all languages with respect, but to promote primarily Ukrainian. This opens this window of opportunity now for the state to make Ukrainian more widely used and more kind of secure in its social complications with Eurasia. Unfortunately, I argue that the state is not doing that for the fear of provoking discontent, but in not doing this, it is provoking discontent among Ukrainian speakers increasingly. It is still not very widespread, and primarily on the elite level, but it will be more and more if the state continues in this way. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker on the panel is Kimberly Marten of Barnard College and Columbia University and its Harriman Institute.
Thank you. Saakashvili may have some of the ambitions that he does right now because he realized he would never make it as mayor of Brooklyn. What I'm going to talk about are the non-state militias that have been on both sides of the conflict. And in my closing conclusions and recommendations, I'm mostly going to be talking to the Ukrainian side because this is a Washington audience and that's where the United States might have some effect. I think the Russians probably already know the lessons and can apply them better. And I'm going to come to some surprising conclusions that include Saakashvili. So I'm going to be applying lessons from my 2012 book on warlords, where I looked at non-state militias in the Pakistani tribal areas, in Sunni areas of Iraq, and in post-Soviet Georgia and Chechnya, and also some additional work I've done on non-state militias in Afghanistan and in the Palestinian Authority. So I'm going to be taking just examples from, we have press reports of what the non-state militias have done in the Ukrainian conflict, but trying to apply the principles from these other conflicts. And the fundamental problem that states face when they choose to work with non-state militias, and the United States has done this all over the world, Russia has done it in various regions, the primary problem that is faced with working with non-state militias is what political scientists call the principal agent problem, which is that you think that the militia is doing what you would like them to be doing, but in fact they have much better information about what's actually happening on the ground than you do, and they also have a very strong incentive not to reveal to the principal exactly what those problems are. And this is a concept that has been applied in security studies for many years in the United States. Peter Fever and Debbie Avent have both applied it even to the workings of the U.S. military, but Debbie Avent has also applied it to working with contract forces in the United States when military contractors are hired. And I would say that it's even worse when you're talking about working with non-state militias and with informal actors, because in that case you don't even have a written contract. There's nothing to rely on, which makes the monitoring of their activities on the ground much more difficult. So why is it that states like to work with non-state militias, even though they have these problems? Well, the obvious reason is that it's cheaper in money and in lives than using your own force to do what it is that you need having done. So in the case of the Kiev side of the conflict, working with non-state militias ends up being a force multiplier for a military service that is seen on the ground in Ukraine as being ineffective, corrupt, and penetrated by Russian forces. That's something that we learned in a group trip that was taken to in May to various cities in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian military doesn't have a very good reputation among Ukrainians. For the Russian side, working with these militias is obviously less politically risky than sending in your own forces to try to hold territory. And for both sides, it gives you plausible deniability. If something goes wrong, you can say, oh, well, it wasn't my state that did it. It was these actors who are not under the control of the state, and you can't blame me. So, what have been the results of this? Well, two extreme examples on each side of the conflict. One was the July 2014 shooting down of the Malaysian civilian airliner by Igor Girkin, or Igor Strelkov. There's no question that Putin would not have wanted that civilian airliner to be shot down. It didn't serve Russian state interests at all, but he did not have control over what appeared to be a really spur of the moment decision by this guy who wanted to prove how strong he was and take some action. And it's really clear that that one incident is what has caused the sanctions against Russia to remain so firm. I was one of the people who predicted back when the sanctions first went into place they could never hold. And what has caused them to hold is the fact that there were hundreds of Europeans, including over 100 Dutch citizens, on that airplane that was shot down. And therefore, the Europeans want to hold Russia accountable for that in a way that they might not have been able to hold sanctions together if we were just talking about Crimea or just the conflict in Donbass. So from the Ukrainian side, we also have a really extreme example of the principal agent problem, and that is Pravy Sector, which is a militia that is widely suspected of having neo-Nazi ultranationalist sympathies, and it has refused to subordinate itself to the Ukrainian National Guard. And the worst incident that we had was obviously a couple of months ago over the summer when they fought openly with the police in violent activities, and they've also agitated in favor of impeaching the Ukrainian government. So on the one side, just before Poroshenko made his statement that Pravy Sector was the biggest threat to Ukrainian national security going forward, which happened in late August, just 2 weeks before that, Pravy Sector was on the front line fighting the Russian-supported rebel groups in eastern Ukraine, and so that's really where the dilemma comes in. More general problems, in all cases, informal militias are usually engaged or often engaged in some form of criminal activity. So for example, we know that Pravy Sector's standoff with the Ukrainian authorities was over cigarette smuggling. Informal militias also have a tendency to violate human rights and to arrest people arbitrarily without going through any kind of judicial process. NGOs, including Amnesty International, have demonstrated that this has happened on both sides in the conflict that's going on in eastern Ukraine. Another thing to think about is that because they're informal, there are no rules for which territory they are supposed to be controlling, and no rules for who succeeds when a particular militia commander is killed or disabled or is no longer working with the support of his men. And so as a result, we see the possibility and the probability that there will be infighting among the militias about who controls which territory, especially when we're talking about criminal smuggling, and also when we're talking about succession as time goes on. And on the Russian side, there have been reports of murderous infighting between Ukrainian Cossacks and Ukrainian non-Cossacks who are on the pro-Russian side of the militias in eastern Ukraine, so that's already starting. We don't have evidence yet of that happening on the pro-Ukrainian side, but I would say that we can just wait and we know it's going to happen. Another fundamental problem of these informal militias, and something that I think has been downplayed in the United States press reports and the United States political statements that are especially coming from the Ukrainian American community in the United States, is the fact that these private militias are often, and maybe usually, recruited from private patronage networks. It's not random people coming together to defend their neighborhoods. It's people who already have very strong patronage connection, client-patron relations, with wealthy people who maybe have already served as, in some ways, a security force for private businesses. They have experience working together, and they have experience in terms of coming together with some sort of a local identity or maybe a workplace identity that is behind a wealthy figure who is somebody who has a great deal of often popular support. And the clearest example of this in Ukraine is Igor Kolomoisky, who currently appears to be in the United States, but even if he is not at home in Dnipropetrovsk, I can tell you that in May, when we were there, his network in Dnipropetrovsk is still very visible, still very strong. He is still very popular, even though he's no longer the political leader officially of the region. He publicly funds both the Aidar and the Dnipro 1st battalions. He is also believed to fund, but he doesn't publicly do it, the Azov and the Donbas battalions. And the reason that Kolomoisky is such an important figure to keep in mind was that armed standoff that he had with the Ukretransneft office who controlled the oil office in Ukraine in March 2015. Now, we don't know for sure that it was the particular militias that I named that were involved in that armed standoff with Ukrainian authorities. But look, what we do know is this. He is able to rally armed men to his side to stand off against the authorities in Kyiv. And so whether or not it was these specific militias or not, that indicates that he's somebody who has some popularity, he has some a local ability to get people on his side, and so it matters less that we know who these people are and more that he was just able to do this. Now, even though many of these informal militias have accepted being placed under the National Guard in Ukraine, and that's something that if you talk to Ukrainian state representatives, they will say, oh, the informal militias aren't actually informal anymore. They're now under the Ukrainian National Guard, and that means that they're under centralized control. My response to that is baloney. Their loyalty, their unit structure, their organizational culture has not changed in the least. They haven't been split up and sent to different locations. It's the same groups that are there, and they may have said, yes, we're loyal to the Ukrainian Ukrainian authorities, but there's plenty of evidence that they don't always follow the rules that are handed down by the Ukrainian military commanders, and that they don't actually respect the Ukrainian military commanders and are off doing their own thing. And so what that means is that going forward, after the war is done, this is going to be a major problem that the Ukrainian authorities are going to have to face. Now here comes to my part where I'm going to give you some controversial policy conclusions that are based from my previous work. The only way to rein in these informal militias is to have outstanding on-the-ground intelligence, human intelligence, about how they run their operations and about what their activities are. Now, Ukrainian intelligence organization is widely seen as being problematic. It is seen as being not effective. It is seen as being penetrated by Russians. And what that means is that most likely the Ukrainian State Intelligence Organization does not have very good information and will not have very good information about who these informal militias are, how they operate, and what that's going to mean going forward. So, how do we get that information? We get that information by working with their patrons. We don't do what all of the Western international organizations have been focused on, which is trying to, get rid of the oligarchs and move to a system that is completely democratic and liberal. And we don't do what Saakashvili has done, and which he should have known better, because he succeeded when he did this properly in his own territories in Georgia, which is you don't come in as an outsider and pretend that you can clean house when you're dealing with strong patron-client relations that are supported by military force. Instead, what you do is you find people who are individuals who can work at that local level and you support them. And it appears that that is exactly what Mr. Poroshenko did when he got Mr. Kolomoisky to step down from his official political position. He paid him off. Now, we don't know exactly what the payoff was, but there was some kind of bargaining that was involved. This was not the strong Ukrainian nation coming and saying to this local warlord, get out of our way because we're going to defeat you if you don't. This was bargaining between patrons and clients. And if you need that bargaining between patrons and clients, it means that the idea of getting rid of the whole existing structure and coming in with these beautiful democratic reforms isn't going to accomplish anything, because guess what? The patron-client structures are stronger than the democratic reforms are. Now, what that did mean in Georgia when Saakashvili was effective is that he was able to work with the sort of the intermediate level members of these patron-client networks to woo them over to the side of the Georgian state, and to get rid of the people at the top that were problematic. And we can talk more about that in Q&A. I don't want to take too much time with the details of Georgia, since that's not really what I'm talking about. But what that would mean in the Ukrainian state is that you have to work with the oligarchic factions, you have to work with the informal networks that are there before you can just come in and toss everybody out. And you don't toss them out by formal methods. You toss them out by very clever, human intelligence-based informal bargaining before you then turn to putting into place a more democratic system. Let me just close by saying that beyond that, we know from the model of the Pakistani tribal areas, and we also know from the model of Upper Kadori in Georgia, that informal militias can actually serve a purpose in overcoming conflict between two sides that face each other on a border, which is that they can be a tripwire and they can be a confidence-building mechanism if it's possible for both sides to believe they can work with them. And that means that these kinds of informal smuggling networks that involve smuggling between the Ukrainian side and the Russian side may actually be very useful in coming to some kind of a negotiated informal settlement of the conflict that currently is present between Ukraine and Russia. And I thought it was sort of ironic that Mr. Putin put forth in the Minsk agreements something that's a very formal understanding of what has to happen in the areas in eastern Ukraine, because it was a very informal understanding in Upper Kadori that basically just said, local authorities will take care of the situation. And everybody knew that that meant it was a particular militia, the Monadiran militia, that would do what it had to do. That was what really kept the Georgia-Russia situation in Abkhazia at least a low violence, relatively stable situation until relatively late in the 2000s. And so I know I'm being very controversial, and I expect to be attacked by all of you pro-democracy advocates out there, but I would just ask you to think about the consequences of getting rid of those informal patronage networks so quickly.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just make one brief comment, just listening to the presentations. I mean, I think the presentations nicely frame, one of the key issues facing Ukraine, which is, maybe you could argue it's a tension between two different kinds of ways in which people can organize to pursue various goals in politics. On one hand, you have the politics of patronage and the politics of networks and battles between clans and oligarchs. And on the other hand, you have the realm of ideas. The idea that people can organize regardless of connections or who you know, but on the basis of principles, whether it's a belief in the nation and what you believe is the national good, or more concrete goals such as pursuing certain types of reform. There is work and discussion in the social science literature certainly about maybe sometimes conflict or wars can kind of lead people to transcend their patronage ties and their connections to work more for the ideals of the nation. But on the other hand, research on civil wars has shown that so much of them is often about the mobilization of specific networks for purposes of conflict. That this becomes a very important part of civil wars, specifically how the different sides and the patrons of each side manipulate the different networks involved. I'll leave that more as a comment, but I would be interested in just the reactions of the participants. I think the research of Volodymyr, Kulyk, and Mikhail Alexseev show that maybe there has been somewhat of an increase in the national identification, which might seem to indicate that, as you put it, Volodya, the salience of national identity as a basis for action. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem like it was a huge increase. So I guess I'd be interested. And that kind of gets to one of the distinctions you drew between your and Mikhail's analysis, is that to what extent was this the war bringing this on as opposed to something transformative about the Maidan events themselves. I think what we'll do now is just open it up for questions and or very brief comments from members of the audience. We'll collect a few, and then we'll turn to the panelists, and then we should have time for at least 2, maybe 3 different rounds. But just ask, please, people to try to keep the comments concise, and I'll try to call on people in the order that I see them. Yes, first, yeah. And please identify yourself.
Hi, Keith Gardner, American University,
member of PONARS.
My question is for Misha and Volodymyr Kulyk. Neither of you said anything about who was being asked in these surveys. And you both make the statement that people change their minds over this time period. In other words, there's been a shift in public opinion. And typically, to make a statement like that, we would have to have a panel survey. In other words, you would have to ask the exact same people in 2012, and then again, or 2013, and again in 2015 to determine whether they've changed their mind. It's my understanding that none of this was panel survey data. And I'm not even sure that we're talking about the same country that's being surveyed. So is it the case that you are restricting yourself to the regions of Ukraine where the survey was conducted in 2015 when you're looking at that 2013 data? Or is perhaps the shift that you're talking about simply the loss of Crimea and the Donbass, where we know those attitudes are different? And so that's one concern. There's also a concern, we all know that it's difficult to conduct surveys during wartime, and Ukraine's at war. And response rates are typically quite low. I talked to Ted Gerber about this a couple of days ago. And so it's certainly possible that the people who are willing to answer a survey now under these circumstances are the ones that might be more likely to voice things that are clearly part of the contemporary party line in Kiev. And so that might also account for some bias in the sampling, that because it's not a panel survey, we really don't know whether opinions have shifted. And if you don't talk a little bit more about the sort of nuts and bolts of the survey, it's hard to have any confidence in the findings.
Okay.
Thank you. I have also a quick question to Misha and Volodya. Thank you. Oksana Shevel, also PONARS. I have a quick question on the surveys also. Since we know opinions change, and thinking of 1991, when a large number of people supported Gorbachev's referendum right in March and then voted in large numbers for independence just a few months later, what is your perception of how lasting this change is? I mean, taking in addition to Lisa's question, sort of to what extent change is real, how likely is it will last in your opinion? And what do you make of the fact that despite this change of opinion, I understand there is quite a bit of draft dodging going on in Ukraine, right? So does this patriotic feeling or increasing patriotic feeling translating or maybe not, into willingness to fight, in the Ukrainian army? And to Kim, very quickly, I think it's really provocative, interesting proposal that you're making. I wanted to ask you this, like, even if we take your argument that, say, keeping these oligarchic networks, the patron-client networks might, and I think it's a question, but let's say, like, it might kind of keep the conflict, more manageable, and, they do their shady, smuggling, and all sides benefit, and it sort of, like, keeps, violence under wraps. But this creates, I would argue, a ripple effect for the country overall, because if the population is expecting the government to fight the corrupt elites, right, it lowers the trust in the government, it makes any kind of reform outside the conflict area, right, more difficult. So what do you make of that? Like, how does your recommendation address that? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's say yes to that.
Elizabeth Wood, MIT, guest. I have a question for Kimberly. Marten, I love this paper. Your argument is that the principal agent issue means it's cheaper in terms of money and lives, but in focusing on the Ukrainian issue, I think you ignored a Russian issue that's very interesting to me, which is the increase in control by working through individuals. And I have two examples in mind. I'm thinking of the role of Militias, the Orthodox oligarch who was behind Sturkov and Baradai. Apparently, there's arguments. And so how do we deal with, I like your basic argument that you go after the informal sector by pitting the middle level against the upper level, but what do you do about the upper level, the Malafiev case, or Zaldostanov and the Night Wolves, or the veterans and their organizations, and their connections straight up to the Kremlin? That gets, because the Kremlin can use, and have you worked on it, have you written about it, the ways in which the Kremlin applies pressure to someone like Malafiev, who then supplies money and arms to the local informal sector. So this is very important.
Okay, gentlemen, then I think we'll ask the authors to give a brief response, and if you could just please keep your response to the minutes. But let's get his question first.
My name is Lasha Kasrazi. I'm with the Mikhail Institute. I have a question, just to shift from the domestic problems to the foreign policy. Is the aspirations towards NATO, are the aspirations toward NATO as enthusiastic, as blatant as they used to be? For example, in Georgia's case in the early 90s, and this is the question to the entire panel. I'm sorry, in the early in 2000s when Saakashvili was in power. Has the conflict exasperated the aspirations to join NATO, or have, generally speaking, the public realized that this is a distant dream at this point, and perhaps we should develop some sort of a diplomatic route with the Kremlin as to avoid further conflicts? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we can go just start with Mikhail. Volodymyr.
Is this microphone working? Yep. Keith, in the ideal world, I totally agree with you. And when my project hopefully comes through, I will have these longitudinal panel surveys in Ukraine on these issues. But before that happens, I also disagree that we cannot have a measure of public opinion longitudinally without panel surveys. You simply get wider margin of errors between different years based on, combined sampling error of different surveys, but you can still get an idea of what public opinion is. And I actually probably have about half a dozen surveys. I was actually surprised how many surveys were done there, and I carefully looked at them. I have designed over 15 years a lot of surveys on these issues across the Russian Federation, huge surveys, and I was looking through that kind of microscope at what these Ukrainian organizations did. So yes, they're not panel surveys, and so not the same people were asked. But we have surveys, some of them with 4,300 respondents, a lot of them over 2,000 respondents, margins of sampling error being 2.5% or less on these. So, and I mentioned also some changes on xenophobia, for example, measures on ethnic language measures. They may be within these combined margins of sampling error, but at least we find out that we don't see a significant, huge change, like, for example, an increase in xenophobia that some studies suggest happens. Some studies have found with worldwide values survey data that exposure for 1 year to a civil war with more than 1,000 casualties in a country increases xenophobia by 50% or so in general. So that, if that happened in Ukraine, that data that I at least looked at would certainly have captured it. Another question I will tackle is Oksana's. You know, yes, there is actually a kind of a curve on Ukrainian national identification, and that's why it's interesting to look at it. In some ways, what it does, it also shows how important it is to look at how war affects identity rather than how identity affects war. What often happens is war is instant, it's turbulent, identities can be affected profoundly and shift, and then post factum, they would be looked as if they were the cause of the conflict and the war, which is why it's so easy to sell the idea that regional divides in Ukraine or language divides or something like that were the primary drive of military conflict, whereas the causality is different. And as far as the draft dodging and commitment to fighting, I don't think any survey data that I have seen will give you a crystal ball. On that, probably here you would be better off thinking in terms of what theories may suggest about it rather than where the data would go, rather than have the data-driven assessment. And of course, it's hard to sustain any kind of patriotic, nationally committed, charismatic effort. So the way to sustain it would be to professionalize it, create a more, you know, larger professional army inducements that it can be a more solid institution that could do war fighting. So that I think is it would be the answer for Ukraine, which will also in some ways address how it's done, probably in conjunction, taking into account a lot of things that Kim mentioned. But that would have to happen. You cannot just forever go on the charismatic nationalist kind of upbeat feeling.
I can start as seconding what Mikhail said about panel surveys being not the only way of measuring changes in identity. It depends on how confident you can be in measuring attributes of the same groups, those groups you are interested in. Regional groups, generational groups, linguistic groups, whatever. So, and with 2,000 respondents across Ukraine, and this very good reputation of Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, whose data I use in both cases, I can be confident that at least some of my conclusions are very solid, some might be problematic. In response to a question about the same country or not the same country, yes, Crimea was excluded from 2012 data to make them comparable with 2014 data. The Donbass, in my survey of September 2014, still included both parts, Ukraine controlled, separatist controlled. At that point, they still allowed the survey takers to work. So, of course, that increased the margin of errors, but the data can be compared. My main concern with this response is how internal displacement affected data. Is this the same country in that way? But that would also make panel surveys much more problematic. I talked to Olga Onov, who was part, I believe, of your common project, and she proudly said, yes, we managed to do this panel survey, but we lost so many people in the process. Is this the same country? This panel is represented as 2 years or a year before. I'm not so sure. And in response to Oksana's question about this army, about Mikhail was starting to answer, I have some focus group data on that. People, I didn't ask specifically, but I was very much eager to hear what they kind of volunteer to provide on that. And some sense that it's very relevant to the question of your identity, changes in your identity as Ukrainian citizens. Yes, if you are a good Ukrainian citizen, shouldn't you be in the army rather than checking here with us in this room? And some said, in this way, ideally yes, but not with this state. Some said, ideally yes, but I'm rather a Ukrainian, so I try to play with terms, your identity as a Ukrainian citizen and as a Ukrainian.
And some solve this controversy, this problem by saying, I'm primarily a Ukrainian rather than Ukrainian citizens, because being Ukrainian citizens would probably send me to the army, and so on. And I can be proud of my country, and now more proud after miraculously my country achieved the Maidan. Yeah, my country is fighting back, not the nation, not the state. Yeah, but the state is still not implementing reform, or the state robbed me of my saving by devaluating hryvnia. So maybe I'm not so proud about my state. Yeah, so people are playing with all these explicitly or implicitly. Some you can judge from their meetings and so on. And finally, I will leave later to you, if you don't mind, but I want to ask what Henry said about this tension between politics of patronage and politics of principles, and how that relates to what war achieved and the Maidan achieved. First, I should mention more strongly, in response to your remark that the change is not so big, we should not underestimate changes induced by the experience of 20 years of independence. If we see that in 2012 already Ukrainian identity, national identity, was prioritized by more than 50% of the population, that's your 20 years of independence. Your textbooks, your inertia of crossing the border with Ukrainian passport, your participation in some rituals involving the flag and president's speeches on the eve of the New Year and so on. So people were already prepared. Of course, revolutions or upheavals are changes to reconsider that, and some might reconsider it in the opposite direction of this. Yeah, but as we see from numerical change, 10% is a respective change. We see that that became much more important to people to think of themselves in terms of national identity rather than local, original. But for the Donbass, it is primarily the change in the opposite direction. Ukraine turned out too problematic for them. If I am for Ukraine, I'm supporting junta, yeah, as the Russian TV taught me. So some of them kind of hide into all other identities, including, remarkably, Donbass is the only region where global identity includes. Anything is better than Ukrainian in that response. But coming back to Keith's question, you know, that might be a problem with sampling. Also for the Donbass, because we are not sure these are the same people who represent the same region. So much internal displacement happened already by September 2014 in that particular region. In all other regions there were new people coming from the Donbass, but they are not so many. They kind of dissolve in the Donbass. You cannot ignore that. So that might be this effect very significant.
Right, very briefly on the question about NATO aspirations, obviously the level of public support for this idea of Ukraine joining NATO has grown dramatically since the Crimea and Donbass events happened and took place. Now we do see unseen before that figures of public support, and that's actually pretty much evenly spread around the regions. I mean, obviously lower in the south and the east, higher in the west, quite high in central Ukraine region, the public support for this idea is. Legally speaking, obviously now Ukraine is not a non-aligned state anymore because this change, there was a change. There was a law when Yanukovych put in place when he came to power on basics of foreign and domestic policies, which basically put forward this non-aligned status. Now it's not there anymore. The road is clear in terms of Ukrainian legislation. All right, but in terms of public, people just learned the lesson, the harsh lesson that was given to them. Because after all, people who were supporting this idea for years, that Ukraine should consider joining NATO. We're saying we shouldn't be left out in the limbo, you know, this gray zone, this lack of security, because we're left defenseless, you know, we're left vulnerable, you know, there is nothing we can do. Unless we are prepared to become a huge military camp with like hundreds of thousands of people, you know, permanently trained and armed, and huge budget allocations for military, which is not probably an option for Ukraine even, which is weak economically as well, on the default, on the verge of default and so on. Unless we are ready to do that, other ways to protect us than looking for this collective security arrangement are just not going to work. And there's another thing, of course, that, you know, ironically, Mr. Putin is saying we moved to Crimea because we thought that new Ukrainian Post-Maidan government is going to just change right away. And of course, when he's saying that, he knows that he's lying, because after all, you know, it's not just about intentions of the Ukrainian Post-Maidan government, it's also about reality. And Ukraine being in a situation not even anywhere close to moving closer towards membership of NATO. But right now he succeeded in consolidating the Ukrainian nation, and right now he is succeeded in this dramatic increase of public support for this idea of NATO membership. Because quite frequently you just hear people saying, well, you know what, I wasn't sure about that before, and if you would have a referendum, I'll probably say no, we don't need to join. But now, since all that happened, yeah, of course, I mean, we need to consider that, because otherwise we would be just constantly positioned to be this victim, who is up at the mercy of some of our neighbors, well, let's say one particular neighbor, but that's it. And if I may just very quickly on what Kim said, I tend to disagree with some conclusions that you make on militias, even though I'm an expert on militias. One thing I would like to say, you mentioned there on one of the phrases that you went with, was that Ukrainian military doesn't have a good reputation, high reputation. What you meant, I think, is that Ukrainian military is not considered professional enough, or trained enough, or mobile enough, and so on. And that's very true. And that's very true. Yeah. No, but I mean, Ukrainian military has a high reputation, a good reputation, nice in Ukrainian public these days. It's just that we understand that these people are not professionally trained, we're not equipped, we're not fed well enough. So they're just not, it's not their blame, that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing defending Ukraine. So I think that would be just wrong to state that Ukrainian military somehow has a low or esteem in the eyes of Ukraine. That's not true. Morally, the entire nation is behind the military. But we understand that there's a long way before this military becomes viable, efficient force for protection of Ukrainian interests. Thank you.
Let me answer Volodymyr's last point first, which is more than lack of training and lack of professionalization and lack of equipment and lack of food. The two things is that there's a lack of respect for the command structure, and that it's not a technically based lack of respect, it is a personal based lack of respect. If the command structure doesn't move quickly enough, that it gives orders that don't make any sense about what's happening on the field, because they stay back in Kyiv, where the fighting is happening in areas where they're not effective. And the sense that we got is that a lot of people think that they're not effective because they're just not. They don't. I mean, it may be lack of training, but it's not lack of training on people in the field. It's a lack of professionalization of high-level officer work. The second thing is that, as sort of has been mentioned in some of the comments from the audience, there is a very high level of draft evasion, and the reason that level is so high is that people are afraid of being cannon fodder. They do not believe that what's happening on the front lines is effective. And we heard stories when they were there about professors who were like in their mid-30s, who were being sent out to be low-level infantry people with no training whatsoever. They basically were told how to shoot a gun in a week's worth of training after having been effectively starved for the 6 weeks that they were there. They were only given one meal a day, and they had to go beg from the local population. There was a really high level of alcohol poisoning. What military in its right mind sends a professor in their 30s to go out and be a low-level infantry, ordinary person without giving them any training? I mean, there's something basically wrong with that.
Which is desperate, the one which is scrambling to do whatever it can.
So, to go on to the points that were raised by the audience and by Henry. First of all, Henry's point on identity, I'm not sure that they are that they're incompatible with each other, because all of these informal militias say that they are fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian people. And so it's quite possible to have Ukrainian national identity at the same time that you also are loyal to a local patron. So I don't see those two things as being in conflict with each other. On Oksana's very good question, Oksana Shel's very good question about decreasing trust in the government, let me just take a little bit of time to explain what it was that Saakashvili did so successfully in Georgia. So it was Shevardnadze, basically, in Georgia, who had worked with these militias for many years, and Saakashvili said, I'm going to come in and make the Georgian state great again by getting rid of these militias. So in the Georgian province of Adjara, which was ruled by this guy named Aslan Abashidze, the way that Saakashvili got rid of him was twofold. One is that he worked with the Russians. He worked with Putin to have the Russian side come in and negotiate with him to get rid of him. And so that indicated that you couldn't really do it if you were in a state of being at war with Russia and have it work as effectively. And the second thing that he did is that it was his university classmate, Levan Varsholomidze, who came in and became the new governor after Abashidze was kicked out of Adjara. Varshalamidze's policy was to basically keep most of the bureaucrats in place that had been there, to continue to pay them salaries as long as they were willing to indicate, for example, by paying a fine, that they were now willing to be loyal to the Georgian state as their patron, as opposed to being loyal to the old Abashidze side. And Varshalamidze was able to do this because his father had been the prime minister of Abashidze earlier on during Abashidze's time in Adjara. So this was not an outsider coming in and doing it from scratch. It was working from the inside, from a network, from a personal connection. In Apokdori, the key to getting rid of Emzar Fitsiani was somebody who, at that time, Saakashvili got along with, even though later on he did not, and that was Irakli Alasania. And Irakli Alasania had great respect in Apokdori because his father had been killed in the fighting in the Abkhazian Civil War as a member of the Georgian security services. Alasania did lots of negotiations where he'd fly into the area and talk to people when the chief warlord, when Emzar Fitsiani was away in Tbilisi. And he got people to come on the side of the Georgian government through a long period of negotiations and bargaining and trade-offs and so forth. So that one took a little bit longer, but it was still through personal connection. At the same time, Saakashvili came in and said, I want a unified Georgian state and I want reform. Now, the truth was that he was still using this form of sort of state patronage to pull people over to his side, but that wasn't the message he was giving. This stuff that was happening was all sort of, behind the scenes and quiet. The message that was coming out is the Georgian state is great and we are reforming, and we're going to do that by showing you that we're reforming the traffic police. And Ukraine has done that. The Ukrainian traffic police from all sides are now reformed. And so in that sense, they're in Ukraine. Yeah.
It's about cities.
Yeah, no, the evidence is, this comes from the Carnegie Endowment has this thing on the process of reforms in Ukraine, and the evidence is that the traffic police are being successfully reformed in Ukraine, and so they're learning that Saakashvili lesson. So this stuff happens quietly. It doesn't have to be on the front pages. The more you can keep it off the front pages, the better. But Poroshenko at one time had some network connections to the Putin network. And I think if he's smart, he will reactivate those because you really need to work with everybody who is a stakeholder in the situation to get things to work. On Elizabeth Wood's really interesting question, I think that Putin has a bigger problem than anything that's happening in eastern Ukraine, and that is the patron-client relationship he has with Mr. Kadyrov in Chechnya. And so he has not always done a very good job of trying to rein things in, although we do have some evidence, and I don't know how you actually demonstrate this, but there are people who are making the argument, including out of this Carnegie Endowment project, that the FSB has been recently going into the eastern Ukrainian areas to get rid of the people who are the most difficult to control, and that one of the reasons that we've seen some personnel turnover in terms of who is leading in the Donbass is an effort by Putin to get people who are going to be more controllable and less kooky in their actions and less violent in their actions to the local population. But again, I don't know how from the outside you'd ever prove that it was the FSB that was coming in and doing that, so at this point that's just a rumor.
Okay, terrific. A lot of great food for thought there. Let's see, I have Rena first here, and then keep your hands up for a minute and I'll try to get everyone down.
Irina Olimpieva, St. Petersburg, Center for Independent Social Research. I have a question to Volodymyr Dubovyk. And you mentioned that there's a growing disappointment that Saakashvili is getting more and more involved in these political battles at the national level. My small question is, do you think that it is possible to make profound institutional changes in one particular region without being involved in these political interactions on the national level? And second small question regarding public support of reforms and perceptions of Saakashvili. Is there any data available about whether people, if there are any changes in people's attitudes to Saakashvili and what he's doing, and so what we call social capital interest? Thank you.
Okay, see Wayne.
Wayne Mary, American Foreign Policy Council. I'd like to draw out Dr. Marten on one aspect of her very fascinating presentation, which is in these kinds of informal battalions, the principal control mechanism of sponsors is what weaponry you provide. And there's a huge asymmetry in Ukraine, because while Moscow has not always been able to prevent its people from using weapons, it has been able to assure almost complete escalation dominance in armor and in firepower. You don't see that on the Ukrainian side, where the military doesn't like to provide weaponry to some of these informal battalions. And the Ukrainian military is sitting on warehouses of anti-armor weapons that they've had for decades, well, for at least for many years, because they had tens of thousands of these things when they were the principal support of the Western forces. But they don't like to provide those because that kind of weaponry can be used in a multitude of environments, including political ones. So I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about this asymmetry, and particularly the tension between having essentially oligarchic and politically based force structures in Ukraine, which have been successful in attracting enthusiastic participants, at least in some parts of the campaign, and their inability or the unwillingness of the government to provide those people with the same kind of lethal weaponry that they give to their own force structure, which I can tell you from my time of working with it, if it wasn't the most corrupt of the post-Soviet militaries, it wasn't for want of trying.
Yeah, Pavel, right behind.
Sure. My question
Just introduce yourself, please.
My question is also, I'm Pavel by the PONARS veteran. My question is also to Kim, and I don't want to attack you from the point of democracy promotion. I want to attack you a little bit from the question of, one point of view of change. Because I think that these battalions are not a thing but a work in progress. And generally I suspect that progress is going in the right direction. And what was there a year ago is not the same thing we have now. Many things are at work here, but fundamentally the battalions created for fighting the war a year ago against Chechens and Cossacks and whatnot are not at all suitable for fighting the war we have now. And they are changing. The identity is changing inside, and the impact of the war, less loyalty to your patron and far more loyalty to your cause. The equipment is changing, the supply system is changing. I would even venture a very problematic proposition that maybe even the US program for training Ukrainian National Guard is making some sort of a difference. So I think that the problem you are identifying is just about to resolve itself.
And there was somebody just behind Pavel who had a hand up. I didn't see who it was.
He said it was the same question that was asked earlier.
Oh, okay. All right. Gentleman there.
I'm Vasily Rotarva, visiting researcher at Georgetown University. My question is concerning Mr. Saakashvili. I mean, was he appointed in Odessa just before Odessa is just the most corrupt, was the most corrupt part of Ukraine, or just because of security importance for Ukraine, giving Novorossiya story and the importance of harbor there? And or just he was appointed in order to cite the local leaders, the local oligarchs there? And up to this point, what Saakashvili has achieved in this direction, corruption and security in Odessa?
Okay, let me just ask the panelists, do you think you could respond to these questions in 2 minutes, or should I go ahead and take all the rest of the questions? We have about 4 more that I've seen, and then would you like to respond to them all at once?
Let's do more.
Okay, that way we won't be restricted. Okay, so I have Mark.
This is for Volodymyr Dubovyk.
Identify yourself.
I'm Mark Kramer from PONARS. And for Volodymyr Dubovyk, could you comment on whether there is an investigation underway of the 2nd of May 2014 events, Volodya? If so, what progress has it made? And to what extent do people discuss that in Odessa, I'm thinking specifically?
Okay, then Yuri.
Yuri Maciejewski, PONARS. I have a comment to Kim's presentations, and it will relate to the questions that were already asked. The comment is that if we want to see the situation in Ukraine in all diversity, we have to try to see the more complex picture that could be taken just from one glance. And when you keep mentioning just 2 battalions as an example of all non-militarily organization, what we call volunteer battalions, but in Ukraine we have 37 battalions, which is not completely penetrated by patronal networks. So most of them are, this is really volunteers that were in a front line because of the Russian aggression. And that's a very important fact. So when you're mentioning your experience talking to one professor who were there, you have to discriminate between drafted people and those who are fighting in volunteer organization. My feeling is that this professor was drafted because we have mobilization. And this is the problem with mobilization, which is the state problem, with the lack of organization. This here I will agree with you on ineffective management of a military campaign here in Ukraine. So if you want to have a broader picture, we have not to simplify it. We have to see different stories and different angles of this situation. Thank you.
Thank you. In the front row.
Alex Militias, I just thank you to all the panelists for your informative comments. I really appreciated them. And I have a comment and a kind of a caveat that I'd like to offer with regard to Kimberly Marten's presentation. You know, first of all, I'd like to remind everyone that, you know, in 4 years, Yanukovych consistently gutted Ukrainian military, so by the time the war started, the militias were the tip of the spear. Now, this process, to the best of my understanding, of bringing them under some sort of centralized control is not something that will take happen overnight. So perhaps in your field research you took a snapshot of what's happening, but it doesn't mean that this is sort of like a definite account of what's happening. This is going to take some time, and it will probably be a gradual process. And the caveat that I'd like to offer is with regard to the Monadire example that you brought. I don't quite understand the relevance of the 2006 Kodori crisis because, you know, as you probably know, this movement was beheaded when Mzar Kvitsiani fled Georgia in 2006 following the operation that was carried out under the Minister of Defense at the time, Okrashvili, and under the Ministry of Internal Defense with Manu Merabishvili's direct participation in it. So I'm not quite sure, you know, maybe you can explain. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have about 16 minutes left for presenters, so just ask to keep your remarks about 4 minutes, and then we should be able to end on schedule. So let's maybe start in the reverse order, as we did last time, if you're ready, Kim.
Sure, that's fine. So first, for Wayne Barry, thank you very much for those insights about why the Ukrainian military is in the situation it is and why the militias are in the situations they are. That's actually the most sophisticated argument I've heard so far on behalf of why outsiders should be arming the militias. And that leads into a whole different debate that I'm happy to get into with you later on. I don't think that's a good idea, but nonetheless, I really appreciate that insight because it's not something that's come out in the media sources so much. Secondly, for Pavlobayev and his optimism, and this sort of relates to the optimism that was raised by the last speaker as well. Loyalty to a cause is really good as long as there's a clear cause to be loyal to. What happens when the fighting ends? What happens when there's no longer an enemy? And all of a sudden, the question is, do you leave your band of brothers and go home to a relatively poor economic situation in a place where you don't have a lot of trust of the state because the state didn't treat you all that well during the time that the war was happening? Or do you decide that maybe by staying with your band of brothers, you can have some impact on the direction that the state goes? And so I mean, you're right, that anything that we say right now about Ukraine is a snapshot. But my take on this comes not from looking at just this Ukrainian snapshot, but what has happened all over the world. In every situation where there have been informal militias that have risen up in support of the state, and I'm sorry, many of these militias are indeed patronage-based militias. They come from local industrialists and other local sort of economic political figures. Even if not everybody in that group is necessarily had a previous tie, there are some international people who are fighting in these militias. But many of these militia members are there because they have some sort of obligation or sense of emotional resonance and ties to the people who are the patrons in the region. That's going to be a choice that they're facing. And what we've seen all over the world is that when wars are over, often the choice that is made, especially if you're going back to the same hometown and the same region, is that you stay in touch with those guys that you were fighting with, and you start talking to each other, and you start saying, I wonder if we could do anything to make this situation better. Ukraine is awash in weapons. They are selling weapons openly in markets in Kiev. You can't get rid of these people and their loyalties just so easily. The dilemma that Yuri raised, I guess I talked about that with the are in fact being, I can't remember what you said, Yuri, I apologize. I have something written down that doesn't make sense to me. Oh yeah,
and volunteers versus the...
Yes, and there are always volunteers, but it is also the case that all over the world people refer to themselves as volunteers who are defending their neighborhoods and defending their homes, when in fact they are simultaneously people who are in these patronage networks. And just sort of, you know, in relation to all the discussion that's happening, the US has learned the hard way that this doesn't work so well in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've tried really, really hard to get these informal militias and these individual warlords and their men to become part of the state structure, and we've said for years, oh, they're part of the state structure. And when push comes to shove, the evidence indicates that they're not so much part of the state structure. And so with all of the resources that the US spends in Iraq and Afghanistan, if it doesn't work, why do we think it's going to work in Ukraine? Finally, on the Georgia, the specifics of it. Where the argument was made that Kitsiani fled after the internal ministry had this very successful operation against them. What I learned from talking to representatives of the internal ministry when I was in Tbilisi in 2009, and I talked to several people who told me about the operation in great depth and diagrams on the board and everything else, is that it was all worked out before they got there, and it was all for show. And that the people that were coming from the internal ministry had to go up a very long mountain road that circled around, and the people from the Montevideo militia had very clear sight lines down, and they could have very easily mined the roads if they wanted to. They could have taken pot shots at people from up above, and in fact there was only one person who was killed accidentally when there was a misunderstanding. So yes, it's true that Kitsiani fled, but Kitsiani fled because the bargain had been reached, and not because the internal ministry went and got him.
What's the relevance?
That it takes informal bargaining and informal cooperation in order to get the secondary leaders of militias to change their loyalty from the militia leader onto the behalf of the state. And if you try to go in and say, we have all these new democratic institutions and it's the institutions that are going to take care of things, the informal militias are still going to keep on operating below the level of the formal institutions.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I got 4 direct questions, but before I go to questions, just one comment follow-up. Kim brought up this question of a reform in police force in Ukraine. Actually, it's a good example of something positive to see there. A lot of people are skeptical, but it's kind of working so far. The municipal police and also traffic police reform in 3 major cities, including Odessa. You now have, since recently, you have this municipal police force and so on. And one thing I would like to mention specifically in this audience is that it's also an example of US taxpayers' money well spent, because it's a project which is directly funded, police reform, directly funded by US government, and that's one of those cases where it's actually a big, huge positive impact as far as we can see on that money being spent. And now let me get to those questions. The first one, is it possible to reform the government, to implement reforms in a particular region outside of the framework and the system of all other regions and the whole state? I don't think so. So I think that initially from the outset, Mr. Saakashvili was doomed to be limited in what he can do, what he can achieve, what he can accomplish in the region. He was given a carte blanche, which was unique if you compare him to many other governors in other regions, because of his closeness, his stature, his closeness, proximity to President Poroshenko, and so on. So there are many governors in Ukraine who are complaining, we just can't do what Mr. Saakashvili is doing because he's definitely given his hands untied. But that's not quite true, because after all, there are so many agencies that are involved, so many players that are involved, branches of power that are involved. So he's not a Tsar or Emperor or the rest of the region, no? He's not. So therefore, he's now complaining himself. You know, he was critical of previous governor of Odessa that he's not doing enough in terms of reforming the region. And now he's been complaining about the government of Ukraine, cabinet ministers preventing him from doing more. You know, so that's Obviously, inevitably, he was doomed to be in this position of limited power and resources and leverage that he has in Odessa. The public support data, I don't have figures for you, but it still stands high. A lot of people still tend to believe his promises that he would achieve more and more in the coming months and so on. If he stays in this position, because we can question now these days what he wants for himself, in these coming weeks and months and so on. This guy never really stays in one place, and I'm sure that with his ambitions, he is not really just satisfied with being just a governor of one particular Oblast region within Ukraine. A lot of people actually on the pro-Russian side in Odessa are not necessarily reviling him or hating him. Ironically, obviously they don't like him initially because that's the guy who fought the war against Russia, and that's the guy who is appointed with his junta government, so there is some rejection. But also, Saakashvili making the statements like, I'm going to make Odessa great again, I'm going to make Odessa like a capital of the region, of the Alexseev region, and a lot of people in both camps, regardless of this divide, pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian, they like this idea, because they do believe that we want to see this Odessa being great again, and prosperity, and an economy booming, and so on and so on. That's another interesting aspect from him. How successful he is in corruption, fighting corruption, well, it's limited, it's hard to say, because, one thing that comes to your mind when you talk about Saakashvili performance in Odessa is transparency. Because a lot of decisions are actually made out in a public view, so people can actually have some control. Like, for instance, this process of vetting the appointments for the county administrators is much more transparent than it's ever been anywhere in Ukrainian history. We really see those people, really see those resumes, and so on. So it's done through interviews, really. So it's not through connections or belonging to particular political forces or parties like it was before in Ukraine always. So it's different now. But on the other hand, you get a lot of people who don't have any experience, and then been vetted by Mr. Saakashvili. Like with many things he's doing, there's plus and minus, pros and cons. Like this is the same thing. You get these people who never run anything, who never managed anything, who never administered anything, and they are being vetted by somehow, for some reason, by Mr. Saakashvili to be running those country administrations. And people are asking, how could it be successful with those people not having enough of experience and background and knowledge to run a government in a particular region or something like that. Finally, on Mark's question, you hear Mark? Yeah. In terms of investigating the May 2nd, it's a complicated, touchy, emotional issue, obviously, for the region, for the city. It's not that we're living somewhere else. We're living in a city that is there to live for years with implications of that tragedy. We personally, in my department, we had one student in our school who died in that union's building. I know one colleague whose son, he's my colleague, he's teaching history, whose son died in that building, both on that pro-Russian side, died in the fire or suffocated or something like that. So it's tragedy. It wasn't properly investigated, I think, even though I would dare to say that whatever investigation you would have in place there will be a lot of people who would not be happy about the results on either side. So you're doomed to have a lot of people who will be saying, oh, I'm not just buying the results of this investigation. Either way it proceeds and goes in this particular case, because the city is so divided, really. But I think it is a stain on the current Ukrainian government that this more efficient and proper investigation is not being done. Just the same way as this Maidan shooting investigation is not being done. And that's really undermined the credibility of this government. It does. Because people are questioning, what are they hiding, And we can say that it's also a matter of lack of professionalism of police force, of law enforcement, and it is because our police in Ukraine have never been good in actually doing police work or investigating anything, right? But also there might be political, elements to it, and that's a lot of people question why it's not being done. The public is actively involved, specifically this quite notorious May 2nd group in Odessa, which has journalists and some other people who are not on any other side, on any side of the divide within the city. They're trying to come up with more information and spread that information and so on. And also a lot of people like myself who are very pro-Ukrainian, we also question who are these people who were caught and stand on trial, because it seems to many of us, including many human rights advocates within Ukraine, that many of those people who were caught for riots, for taking part in the riots on May 2nd, they are just pawns. They're just people who were caught almost randomly in the street. What about those who actually ordered those disturbances, who prepared the plan for disturbances, who funded the disturbances in a particular day? Those are just, many of them missing, went somewhere, many don't know their names. So what we get a couple dozen people who were actually just caught in the middle of the street. And they probably deserve some punishment in terms of Ukrainian law, but they are not definitely those perpetrators of the violence and who are at the roots of the violence of the particular day. Thank you.
Thank you. No question was addressed to me directly, so I will take this opportunity to talk about this generally defined battalions or militias problem, but I will start with what I just said about this dissatisfaction with how the state is performing, lack of trust in this readiness to reform itself, lack of trust in its determination to go through as far as the Maidan hoped. And that's a crucial issue which is related directly to this militia problem, because militias, these volunteering battalions, are seen as just kind of one armed branch of this Maidan army. So you will be fighting there in the Donbass, and we will be fighting here, driving all those old guard bureaucrats or Yanukovych associates out of their offices and all that. And on some occasions, we, and I count myself among those who was involved in some activist actions, demonstrations, and so on in the capital. We counted on these battalions in the right sector as helping us, because it was quickly became obvious that the old guard are kind of regrouping, re-emerging, and regaining confidence, and they would be ready to ignore us the way they ignored us after the Orange Revolution. And the people who were very apprehensive of all military action in the peaceful cities and of all uncontrolled waving of guns were painfully aware that without the some readiness to use force if desperately needed, the tempo of reform would be lower than the otherwise. So kind of this gun waving on the wall, you know, so hanging on the wall. And fortunately, we all hoped it will never have to be used, but it will be theirs for them to see it and not be so confident in being able to revert to things as they were under Yanukovych. And all activists, all elites were painfully aware of the 2 points of this series, so defense and reform, as two tests which have unfortunately to be done simultaneously. We cannot afford waiting until the war is over to start doing reform, because unreformed Ukraine would be much weaker Ukraine, both domestically and internationally, and we will be unable to actually win. And on the other hand, many people were aware, and my Facebook is a good illustration to that. Many people were aware that these protesting activities and use of weapons can be very destabilizing to Ukraine and actually very harmful to protest activities. And as much as people might be dissatisfied with what the government is doing, with what the president is doing, they were saying, okay, you can overthrow Poroshenko, but then your next president is none other but Putin. So this awareness of destabilizing effects of this radical protest kind of come down a bit, so put a constraint on what these protesters were doing, regardless of this problem of trust and dissatisfaction with the reform performance. But final point. You can say that there is no change of structure in these militias. I disagree. There is actually a lot of structure change in the battalions. The problem with the right sector exactly is its resilience, its resistance to be changed, to fit into the forms provided by the state. You can be either part of the army, the armed forces. You can be either part of the National Guard. There is no other way to retain as a military unit. And the right sector, combining these two faces, being on the one hand military unit, on the other hand a kind of political movement, so far has successfully avoided that.
So have units of other militias been broken up so that personnel are going to different geographical areas on the
that the problem is not limited to militia. Part of the problem is that the command is ineffective, and the trust is low in its effectiveness and its kind of serving the cause that people are wanting them to serve. And that's why, for example, the problem of smuggling, it's not so much a problem of battalions, it's a problem of the regular units of the army. And that's why many people believe that the battalions or activists are essential there to solve that problem, because the army is serving in a way, some units of the army are serving in a way as militias, you know, because they are not subordinated fully to the state, to the visible side of the state, but on the other hand, they are involved in this patronage politics. Yeah, so it's all much more complicated than that. It's not the good army versus bad militia. It's the kind of mixture of those, lack of clear line between them and their agenda. That's the main problem.
Very quickly, I think the survey data, mass survey data, does give some idea as to why outcomes in Ukraine may be different than in Pakistan, Afghanistan, in terms of militias, because if you see overall the increase in the sense of civic national pride, while xenophobia and other intolerant trends are kept at bay, eventually hope is that would work its way through and have beneficial effects, including the military. As far as the military, I totally agree with Pago, actually. When I first saw the Ukrainian forces move into the areas of Donbass to fight people in the Slavyansk taking over government buildings, I was totally appalled. You know, it looked like they were armored personnel carriers out of mothballs. You know, from the peak of the Cold War, the uniforms were shabby. You look at them now, you see quite a bit of difference. I think if you look at the posture of the soldiers, you look at the uniforms, you look at the equipment, you will see a difference. It does look like a more professional, actually, national army. So, and it would dovetail with positive, social trends. Finally, I just had one last comment. There was one data point and on whether Ukraine is one country or not. There were actually still polls in Crimea in 2013, and we don't have the data for 2015, but there was one question. Do Ukraine and Russia need to unite in a single state? Now, in Crimea, 24% of respondents in May 2013 said yes. In the east of Ukraine, 28% of respondents said yes to that question, and in the south, 20% of respondents said to the question. So the exclusion of Crimea doesn't actually change much the overall dynamic there. And in fact, we also see how war affects identities and can affect identities so quickly. It's not that Crimea wanted to join and then Russia helped. It's that Russia helped and then somehow, yes, we want to join. So beware of these things. Thank you very much.
Announcements. So first of all, we'll have coffee break outside. We'll have coffee break until 11:15 when we'll break up into two panels going on simultaneously for people